Chapter 14. Toby was wrapped in an army blanket, his feet bare. Annabelle? It was both statement and question. Hey, Toby. I realized that I had no idea what his last name was. No way to call him Mr. anything. He looked past me, perhaps expecting my father to walk out of the gloom. What's wrong? The constable told us you'd gone away and might have taken Betty with you, or that you know where she is. And he called the state police, and they are going to be here soon to look for you. I had more to say, but that much had used up all my breath. He thought about that for a minute. The girl who said I threw a rock at the German? I nodded, the beginnings of confusion like an itch inside my head. Yes, she's been missing since yesterday morning. Didn't you know that? People are looking for her everywhere. I could see that this was truly news to him. The constable came to see you last night, but you weren't here. He thought you'd left. Maybe with Betty? My voice trailed away. His white face was even whiter now. You didn't know she was missing? He shook his head. I was fishing under the creek bridge, traded the fish to Turner for jerky. The Turners raised cattle and pigs for meat. My father liked their jerky too, and it lasted for a long time, with or without an icebox. Stayed in their barn until the rain let up. Came back here late. He turned and looked into the smokehouse. Someone stole one of my pictures. I never heard Toby say so much at one time. Constable Oleska took it, I said, the one that showed me on the path to school. And he looked at the pictures that just came back in the mail, too. I'm sorry about that, but Aunt Lily gave them to him. You took one from up the hill above Mr. Ansel's wagon the day Ruth got hurt. Toby gave me a hard look. I didn't throw that rock, he said. Hearing him say it was good, though I hadn't realized I needed to hear it until I did. I believe you, I said, but now they know you were on that hill, and Betty said she saw you throw the rock, and now she's missing. They think you did some bad things, Toby. Toby took a long breath. I did, he said. I crossed my arms over my chest, which made me feel bigger. What did you do? He pulled the blanket tighter around himself. I waited. I said, but you didn't throw that rock. It still sounded too much like a question. He shook his head. She did. I was surprised, though I had suspected as much. You saw her? I tried to take her picture, but she threw it so fast, and then she ducked into the bushes, and that boy with her, and not before she saw me a bit higher up than they were, and knew that I'd seen her. Then why didn't you say so when my father came to talk with you? Toby looked away. Things come out right, or they don't. What? Toby, you should have told him what happened. Nobody's going to believe you now. Nothing I can do about that, he said, an odd and frustrating way to look at the world, but I was not Toby, and he was not me. We stood for a long moment. All around us, birds woke up the sky. And I heard in the distance people calling for Betty. Toby took a step back into the smokehouse, which made up my mind for me. All right, I said firmly. I want you to come with me now. Toby's mouth twitched just a little. It was the closest thing to a smile that I'd ever seen on him. You sound like your mother. I took that as a compliment. Good, because if she were here, she'd say the same thing. Please, now, I said. Will you get dressed and come along? Toby seemed to be torn. Where to? Somewhere safe until we can sort things out. He shook his head. Doesn't matter much to me. Well, it matters to me, I said, and if you don't care one way or the other, how about we do it my way? Again, that twitch. Again in the distance, the sound of people calling. After a few minutes, Toby joined me outside the smokehouse. He was dressed as always, the camera around his neck, his gun slung across his back. The walk back up the hill was harder, but Toby climbed behind me, waiting while I tree-poled myself up the steepest parts. Worse, because they were slippery. The strengthening light helped a lot, but it worried me too. We were very watchful and as quiet as we could be, given the shouting in the distance. Had I feared real hunters, I would have worn red, but we were both in brown and black, invisible if we stood still and hid our faces. As we crested the hill and made our way toward home, I realized that everyone would be able to see us through the farmhouse windows if we came across our pasture. So we kept to the woods until we were on the far side of our barn, cut across the open quickly, and ducked in from the back. I went ahead first, calling to see if anyone was around, happy that the dogs were part of the search, pretending to help. When one of the horses swung his big head over the stable door and looked at me curiously, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Time for you to be out, Bill, I said, unlatching the Dutch door and pulling it open. He snorted at me and sauntered down the aisle toward the big open gate that led to the pasture. I freed Dinah next, and she followed him into the sunlight, her tail twitching. Next, the milk cows, Molly and Daisy. We never named the cows since we had to give them up so quickly, but our milk cows we kept until they had to go. I put out my hand as they lumbered past me, and the second of them planted her big square black nose in my palm for a moment, the hair on it a soft bristle. Had my father not been out searching for Betty, he would have already set them loose by now. I hoped that the sight of them in the pasture would keep anyone from coming out to the barn to do that chore, though they might come to see who had done it. I wondered if anyone had missed me yet. Follow me, I whispered, called to Toby, opening the door to the stair that ran up the middle of the barn to the threshing floor. Ours was a banked barn, set into the side of a hill, with stalls down below that opened into a long aisle. A cistern squatted on a slab at the back of the barn next to a long corn crib. A huge pair of side doors on the top level opened to a lane and staging area on the upper slope. We could drive hay wagons up that lane and in through the side of the barn, store the big equipment in the winter, work there in foul weather. Big tubs of oats stood next to grain chutes that led straight down to mangers in the stalls below. Part of this upper level had a very high peaked roof hung with ropes and tackle for hoisting bales into the loft that consumed the better part of the space along the rafters. It was an old barn with some missing planks and years of dirt and straw built up on the floor, but it was dry enough and plenty snug in the hayloft, where my father liked to nap on rainy days. I hoped for a nice stretch of dry weather. At the foot of the long ladder to the loft, Toby stopped. He looked at the ladder, looked at me, looked back at the ladder. I started up. Come on, I said over my shoulder. You can wait in the loft until everything gets sorted out. But he stayed where he was. I don't like high places, he said. I almost fell off the ladder. He didn't look pleased when I started to laugh, so I stopped and climbed back down. He was a big man in a black oilcloth coat, 3 guns slung across his back, long, gnarled hair and beard, a black hat, a white face barely visible in the shadow of its rim. A man who'd been through a terrible war, a man who lived mostly on game and berries in a smokehouse in the woods. You're afraid to climb up to the loft? I asked him. He ducked his head, shifted his guns. I chewed my lip. You live in hill country, I said. You're high up most of the time. He shook his head. Not the same. Well, I said, you can either climb up to the hayloft or you can hide in the corn crib with the mice. This time, I, too, heard my mother in my voice. Perhaps it was the word hide or the idea of clambering into a corn crib that did it. Perhaps his suggestion that he was a mouse. Toby didn't say, but after a moment he flopped a hand at me, and, when I began to climb the ladder, followed. From the top I looked back and saw him slowly climbing, 2 feet on every rung, gripping the side rails hard. His left hand, knotty and slick with scars, focused on what he was doing, never looking down. The hardest part was at the top. He slapped his good hand out on the floor of the loft and dug his nails in. I grabbed his wrist, though largely for moral support, and he crawled off the ladder and cleared the edge of the loft, breathing harder than he had as we had climbed the hill out of Cobb Hollow. I didn't tell him that it would be harder still to climb down. At least I could assume he'd stay where he was for a while. That first step down onto the ladder from above would keep him put while I figured out what to do next. I'll be back as soon as I can with some food and water, I said, and a bucket for, well, you know. I could feel myself pink up. If anybody comes in the barn, just scoot back between the bales and stay quiet. The boys might come around, but they'll probably stay out of the loft. Toby sat down on a bale of hay. When he laid his guns aside and took off his hat, he looked like a boy himself. Much older, of course, but just as young. Don't worry, I said. Everything will be fine.